You've probably watched this happen to someone genuinely sharp, someone who reads people well, who's usually the first to spot a manipulation in someone else's life, and yet somehow stayed in a relationship, a friendship, a job, long after the warning signs were undeniable to everyone around them. And you've probably done a version of it yourself, noticed something off early, and instead of walking away, built a perfectly reasonable explanation for why it didn't actually mean what it looked like it meant. This isn't a failure of intelligence. It's almost the opposite. Intelligence is precisely what makes this pattern so effective, and understanding why changes the way you evaluate your own judgment going forward. Here's the part that surprises people first. A red flag isn't actually hard to notice. Most of the time, the noticing happens instantly. A flicker of discomfort, a small inconsistency between what someone says and what they do, a gut-level unease that arrives before you've consciously processed why. The problem was never detection. The problem happens in the very next step, the interpretation, and that's exactly where a sharp, capable mind does something a less analytical one can't do nearly as well. It builds a convincing story that explains the discomfort away. This is the actual mechanism, and it's worth sitting with, because it reframes the whole issue. Intelligence, especially the kind that's good with language, context, and nuance, is extremely skilled at generating plausible alternative explanations for almost anything. Someone cancels plans again. A less analytical mind might simply register, "This keeps happening." A sharper mind immediately generates context. "They've had a rough week. They did apologize sincerely. Everyone deserves grace. I'm probably being too sensitive about this." None of these explanations are dishonest exactly. They're often genuinely plausible, which is precisely the problem. A red flag rarely survives contact with a good enough excuse, and smart people are unusually good at producing excuses good enough to survive almost anything. Here's the hidden cost of being this capable at explaining things away. Every time a plausible explanation successfully neutralizes a warning sign, the mind doesn't just move past that one incident. It builds a kind of running commentary that gets applied automatically to the next warning sign, and the one after that, each new red flag getting folded into an existing, comfortable narrative instead of being evaluated fresh. This is why the pattern tends to escalate specifically for capable, analytical people, not despite their intelligence, but because of it. Once you've successfully explained away the first 3 concerning signs in a relationship, the 4th one gets measured against a narrative that's already been built and defended, rather than being looked at on its own. There's a deeper reason this happens, and it isn't really about a lack of information. It's about what the information would cost you if you let yourself fully register it. Acknowledging a red flag clearly and completely usually means acknowledging something uncomfortable alongside it, that you might need to leave a relationship you've invested years in, that a job you took a risk on might not work out, that someone you vouched for to your friends and family might not be who you presented them as. The discomfort isn't just about the other person's behavior, it's about what accepting that behavior as real would require you to do next, and a sharp mind is very good at finding reasons to delay that requirement indefinitely. This is also where hope does some of its most dangerous work. It's not naivety that keeps smart people invested in situations that aren't working. It's a specific, well-reasoned kind of hope, backed by genuine evidence. This person does have good qualities. They were different at the beginning. They've shown real effort at times. So the story becomes, if I can just be patient a little longer, the good version will come back and stay. This isn't a stupid conclusion. It's actually a fairly sophisticated read of real, existing evidence. The problem is that it deliberately weighs the good moments more heavily than the frequency and consistency of the bad ones, because the good moments are the ones that make continued investment feel rational rather than reckless. Here's something else worth understanding, because it explains why external warnings so rarely work on someone caught in this pattern. When a friend says, "This doesn't sound right to me," they're offering a single, isolated observation. The person hearing it, however, has an entire, carefully constructed narrative built from months or years of context the friend doesn't have access to. Of course, the friend's warning loses. It's a single data point going up against an elaborate, internally consistent story that's been under construction for a long time. This is why telling someone to just see the red flags rarely works. The flags were seen. They were processed through a narrative sophisticated enough to survive the seeing. There's a final piece to this worth naming honestly, because it's the part people are least willing to examine in themselves. Being the kind of person who notices everything and still stays anyway can start to feel like a strange kind of virtue. Loyalty, patience, the refusal to give up on someone too quickly. And sometimes those really are virtues. But it's worth distinguishing between staying because you've honestly weighed the evidence and concluded it's worth it, and staying because leaving would require admitting that your excellent judgment missed something, or worse, saw it clearly and chose to override it anyway. The second version is far more common than most capable people want to admit, because unlike missing something, choosing to override what you saw clearly is much harder to forgive yourself for. So what actually protects against this, given that the problem was never awareness in the first place? Here's a concrete method, not just a reframe, built specifically around the mechanism we just walked through. First, separate the observation from the explanation. In writing, the moment something registers as off. Not days later, not after you've already built a narrative around it. Write down exactly what happened, in the plainest possible language, with no context attached. They said they'd call and didn't. 3 times this month. Not, they're busy and it's understandable. Just the fact. Isolated. This matters because the explanation is where the distortion happens, and separating the two, even briefly, interrupts the automatic process of folding a new red flag into an existing defense. Second, track frequency, instead of evaluating incidents individually. A single instance of almost anything can be explained. A pattern is much harder to explain away, which is exactly why the mind avoids looking at things as patterns and prefers to process them one incident at a time, each one small enough to dismiss on its own. Keep a simple, ongoing list, even a mental one, of how many times a specific concerning behavior has repeated, not what excuse accompanied it. Numbers resist narrative in a way that individual memories don't. Third, deliberately borrow someone else's narrative distance instead of just their opinion. Don't ask a friend what they think of the situation in general. Describe the specific, isolated facts from your list without the surrounding context you've built, and ask what they'd think if a stranger described this exact pattern to them. This forces the comparison you're avoiding, comparing your situation to how it would look without the years of accumulated justification attached to it. Fourth, set your threshold before you need it, not during the moment you're deciding whether to act on it. Decide, in a calm, uninvested state, what specific pattern would be a deal-breaker for you in a relationship, a job, a friendship, before you're inside a situation where hope and sunk cost are actively distorting your judgment. Write it down somewhere you'll actually see it again. This works precisely because it removes the decision from the moment when your analytical skill is most likely to be recruited in service of staying rather than in service of seeing clearly. None of this requires becoming less trusting or less generous with people by default. It requires recognizing that your intelligence, left unmanaged, will reliably work against your own best interest in exactly this specific situation, not because you're foolish, but because you're capable enough to build a case for almost anything, including staying somewhere you already know, underneath the narrative, that you shouldn't. Because the truth about ignoring red flags isn't that smart people fail to see them, it's that smart people are unusually good at building a story convincing enough to make seeing them feel optional, and the actual skill worth developing isn't sharper perception. It's the discipline to let what you've already seen clearly stay seen, without recruiting your own intelligence to talk you back out of it. If any part of this resonated with you, if you've caught yourself explaining away something you already knew, leave a comment and let me know what stood out. Chances are, you're not the only one who's done this. Thanks for listening to episodes of Kynn. Take care of your mind, and I'll see you in the next episode.